Hello, it's Jen Taub. Welcome back to Booked Up, a podcast that features you, me, and our favorite authors. Today, my guest is Eric Muller. He is the author of a provocative and very original new book called Lawyer, Jailer, Ally, Foe. This book is about a topic that is part of a shameful period of American history, and yet very few of us learn about it in school, and even fewer of us ever talk about it. And what I am referring to is how Franklin Roosevelt, someone who we often admire for his work during the New Deal, but how he signed an executive order in early 1942, which allowed our government to create military zones up and down the west coast of America, from Washington to Oregon to California and even parts of southern Arizona. And what were these zones for? They were designated zones so that people who were of Japanese ancestry, including American citizens, were subjected to unconstitutional removal and imprisonment. What Eric writes about is what he rightfully calls concentration camps. Yes, he calls them that because these places, which were euphemistically referred to as relocation centers, were prisons. And as he notes in my interview with him today, that's how these concentration camps were referred to at the time, as camps. Now, they did, back in the 40s, call the Japanese Americans who were forced to live there evacuees, a euphemism, but they were prisoners. They were not free to leave. What makes Lawyer, Jailer, Ally, Foe so special is that after all of Eric's research and writing over the years, when he has focused on the lives and treatment of those Japanese Americans and people from Japan who were in the concentration camps, he chose to write this book about the project attorneys, the program attorneys, that is, who worked inside of one of these 10 concentration camps. He chose 3 of them, one located in Wyoming, one located in Arizona, and another located on an Indian reservation. And he focuses on the lives of these project attorneys or program attorneys. I guess I think I'm using both. He focuses on the lives of 3 of them. One named Jerry Housel, another Ted Haas, and the third Jim Terry. And the title tells you a lot of what Eric and these folks were wrestling with. On the one hand, they're lawyers representing the U.S. government agency that opened and operated these camps from 1942 through 1945. But they weren't just lawyers, they were jailers. They were part of that system. So they weren't just representing the government, but in doing so, they worked for a jail. But on the other hand, they also acted as allies and lawyers for the people inside the camps, because they were kind of like legal services lawyers for the people living there. If someone was a prisoner in the camp and they needed a divorce, or there was some kind of contractual dispute, or they even need a lawyer to represent them because of their property back home where they came from, let's say in Washington State. This is what these lawyer jailers were doing. But they weren't just allies, they were also foes. On the opposite side of disputes with some of the folks who were imprisoned there. This is an absolutely fascinating study because the way Eric writes this book is through these 3 parts, these 3 vignettes, essentially, centering around these lawyers at the 3 camps. I cannot recommend this book enough. Now, normally I tell you what the writer's credentials are, and trust me, he's all credentialed up. He's a he has a chair, named professorship in law, in jurisprudence and ethics at the University of North Carolina School of Law. He is one of the leading scholars of the removal and imprisonment of Japanese Americans in World War II. And he also writes in the area of constitutional criminal procedure, the law of slavery, and the Nazi legal system. Also, what I should say, which I did not get a chance to mention, is that he has the most adorable Havanese. I think she weighs only 12 pounds, and her name is Josie. And throughout our interview, she was making all kinds of noise, which I don't think you'll be able to hear because we have a kind of sound guru who is able to hopefully remove anything that would distract you from the incredible discussion that we had. Now, I know I am raving about lawyer, jailer, ally, foe, but you have to trust not just me. I'm sure you've heard of novelist John Grisham. His praise for this book appears on the cover, and he said that it was a fascinating and detailed account of one of America's darkest chapters. Okay, let's dive in. Eric?
Yes.
Hello? You're almost as good as me. This is like how I show up.
What happened was I got all set up, and then I thought, I'm talking about my book. Maybe it would be a good idea for me to have a copy of my book handy.
I do. Do you see it? It's right there.
I do see it very prominently. It's lovely.
Can I just say, did you get to choose the paper for the book jacket?
No.
Did you know it was going to be so soft?
I did not. What I did know is that UNC Press makes beautiful books. Their books are always amazing.
I care so much about the book as an object. It turns out that my husband, Michael, is a book artist. I don't know if you know, there's this niche in the world. The, rare book libraries like the Library of Congress, where they have Jefferson's Bible and stuff like that.
Sure.
So they also collect what's called artist books, which are handmade, limited edition books. And he's done things including sometimes his own poetry, but he's also done Anthony Hecht, who was a former poet laureate, illustrated or made artwork for one of his poems. He's done a lot of really cool stuff. So I really care about every aspect of the physical book and the artwork too. And I know they say you can't judge a book by its cover, but I have to tell you, when I saw the title and the cover of this online, even before I had the book in hand, I knew I wanted to read it.
Yeah, it really is when I opened up the JPEG with their draft up, their mock-up of the cover, I just about fell over. I just thought it was spectacular.
And this isn't even, this is your fourth book.
Yes, it is.
And so I don't want to insult any of the other covers. I don't mean that, but you noted in your acknowledgments that it was the hardest thing to bring to life. So maybe seeing this cover made it easier for you, or?
Well, I had already finished the book by the time the cover materialized.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah. I'm a slower person. They often show me the cover and I'm not done and I have a heart attack.
No, I think it would have prompted me to stay passionate about it. Well, passion wasn't the problem. I think it would have prompted me, but no, I had finished the book, and it was not until it was, well along that I saw the cover, and I was just absolutely thrilled.
So before we get into it, though, I want to ask you sort of the basics. Where are you seated right now?
I am seated at the desk in the bonus room of my house in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, where I have spent terrifying amounts of time since March of 2020.
In that office, or just in terms of, or your GPS coordinates?
In this space. This is where I taught from during the pandemic for a year and half.
Oh, you guys didn't go back into the classroom in the fall of 2020?
So the university tried to reopen in the fall of 2020. They made a big showing about how we were going to be different and special. And the university stayed open for 4 days, and then they sent everybody home. And It was not until the spring of that year, so that would have been 2021, that was 100% online, as was. So is that right? Yeah. So I think it was the balance of the spring of 2020, all of fall, and then most of the spring of 2021 was all online. And then we were present, but we bounced back and forth a bunch based on, the Omicron and Delta and what have you.
Yeah.
So this seat is well worn from all of the teaching.
Same with me. Although we were back in the fall of at Western New England in the fall of 2020, we were actually back doing a kind of hybrid.
How did you manage that? Okay,
so you're not going to believe this. I had been at Vermont Law School before that, so I had just joined Western New England, and so that August, September of 2020 was my first semester there. Plus, I used to teach contracts, and I had switched to Civ Pro. Okay, so I'm now new school, new prep, and they had hybrid classes. So literally, I was always in the classroom for my 80 plus Civ Pro students, but like 44 of them would be in the classroom and 44 would be home, and they would rotate. And then they were separate. So imagine trying to teach on Zoom where you have like 40 plus people at home, but 40 are in the room in front of you. Like how big do you gesticulate? And like also whiteboards are reflective. So the people at home wouldn't be able to see them. Right. So I was having those giant 3M, sheets so that I could actually draw pictures of jurisdictional. But it was a lot. I have to tell you, it was a lot.
Were the people who were there in person in the room, were they wearing masks?
Yes, we were all wearing masks.
So, Jen, I'm maybe alone in thinking this, but I'm certainly in a tiny minority. I actually preferred teaching on Zoom to teaching to a room full of masks.
Same.
Because the analogy I've used is it's like teaching a room full of crash test dummies. That just like you have no idea what's going on, no idea what they're thinking, how they're reacting,
true.
Are they nothing.
Well, it's so funny because I thought I got used to, there's this thing that happens where when you've been staring at people in masks, you look at their eyes and you try to see, you invent the mouth. And then it was so funny because we wore masks until like after spring break of 2021, right? Mm-hmm. Students took off their masks, and there was this one student who I always thought was sort of distant and bored, and she has this giant smile plastered on her face. And I'm like, wow, I didn't know that's who you are. And she said, yes, my face speaks loudly. And I didn't know that about.
I had a student in the constitutional law class that I taught that was 100% Zoom the whole semester. When we came back together in the fall of 2021, I saw this. There was a woman in the class who was an outstanding student, very articulate, volunteered a lot, kind of student you just love to have.
Yeah.
And so I'm walking down the hallway, and this 6'3" woman is walking towards me with the head of the woman from Zoom on her shoulders. And I was like, oh my gosh, wow, it's so nice to meet you. It turns out she had been like on the UCLA volleyball team or something. I mean, she as an undergrad. So no, I mean, anyway, it's so, it feels safe to talk about. So much of that period was so painful. And I have to tell you, speaking, not just not seeing people, but it got exhausting to teach with the mask on. I had out of breath, blah, blah, blah. Okay, but it's been, and the eyeglasses, the eyeglasses, the fogging problem.
Oh, yeah. I couldn't wear, I was constantly taking my glasses off so I could either see. So not only that, right, you couldn't even see your students with them.
That's right.
Okay, thank God that's over. Yeah. And it's so funny. This makes an interesting segue because it did feel like kind of imprisonment, but nothing, of course, to comparison to the concentration camps that housed people of Japanese descent during World War II.
That's for sure.
Which is not just the subject of this book, but also a lot of your work. And I kind of want to back up even before you wrote this book. And actually, you know what? Oh, shoot. I do want to ask you something really critical right now about what's happening right now, and then we'll talk about the book. But since you are in North Carolina and you teach at UNC. This morning, it's, Thursday, the June 29th when we're speaking. This morning, the U.S. Supreme Court just ruled against your university in the affirmative action case brought by, I think it's called students
for fair admissions.
For fair admissions, which is a bit of a euphemism for students against affirmative action, but students for fair admission against Harvard and North Carolina, these two separate cases. Have you had a chance to look through that, or do you have an opinion on the court's opinion?
I read the syllabus. Which is lengthy, at the beginning of the opinion. I read that pretty carefully, but I have not, with the exception of a couple of footnotes that I saw referenced on Twitter, that seemed to merit careful reading. I did not. I haven't read the full opinions yet. So
same with me. Yeah, I read the syllabus and then I jumped into the two dissents just to get a feeling for it. Yeah. I won't test your knowledge of that. But you've had 2 days, Eric, now on Moore versus Harper. So come on.
Yeah.
So Moore versus Harper was a case involving your state's legislature related to districts for congressional elections. Right. Are you going to teach Moore versus Harper in con law next year? And if so, or even if not, what do you think about the independent state legislature doctrine and where the court landed?
To be candid with you, I thought the independent state legislature doctrine was a fever dream of some folks, some originalists, and some folks on the right. It had never, that approach to the clause had never been adopted in any Supreme Court opinion. It was floated very briefly in that magnificent precedent, Bush versus Gore.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. And so, I was kind of astonished that it was actually being taken as seriously as it was being taken. And the fact that it only drew 3 votes on this court tells you a lot about the validity of the independent state legislature theory. They couldn't, they couldn't even pull 5 votes for that with this group of justices who many of them, identify very fervently as originalists. I wasn't surprised. I was surprised that they reached the merits, of course, but I was not, because of what had happened here in the state with the state Supreme Court basically withdrawing the earlier opinion.
Thinking that they would have just said, we don't even have jurisdiction to hear this.
They would have said it was moot. I think a lot of people expected that they were going to say it was moot because the North Carolina Supreme Court, when it changed political hands, one of the first things they did was to reach back and overrule effectively the decision that was before the U.S. Supreme Court. So lots of people thought that would be the end of the case. The majority came up with a way of finding that the case was still a live controversy and not moot. So that surprised me a little, but it didn't surprise me that the independent state legislature theory did not attract 5 votes because it just seemed so.
But for non-lawyers, because it's so funny, I know as a law professor that it would be possibly doubtful that a case like this would come up in a constitutional law class. It's more like an election law type case that just touches on the Constitution. And I wonder if you can then imagining, if you were not teaching an election law class, but if, you're talking to someone who doesn't know much about law, how would you describe this sort of what had gone down in North Carolina and what those, what the crazy, if we say crazy or the, not based in any kind of real constitutional jurisprudence, this independent state legislature theory, wiping away all these labels that people might confuse the public. What was going on here?
So what was going on is that the U.S. Supreme Court held a number of years ago now that partisan unlike racial gerrymandering, partisan gerrymandering districts for political advantage, was not a violation of the U.S. Constitution. But in that opinion, the Supreme Court noted that it may be the case that state constitutions would cover partisan gerrymandering. And so in 2020 or 2021...
Cover, you mean might forbid?
Might forbid, yes, right. That it might be a concept that would be addressed in a state constitution and then also forbidden by a state constitution. And the North Carolina Supreme Court concluded just that in Moore versus Harper. In 2021, they concluded that partisan gerrymandering was a violation of the North Carolina Constitution.
And let's just stop there for 1 second and just to say, tell me if I get this right, but what people mean when they say partisan gerrymandering would be, let's imagine for a moment that, 50% of a state votes Democratic and 50% votes Republican, but because the Republicans may have power, they wanted to redistrict it's so that you would only end up, instead of half of the congressional seats going to each party, maybe 2/3 or 80% would go to them because they were in power. They figure out how to draw the lines based on where people reside, or vice versa.
Right. You've just described North Carolina to a T. Right. So North Carolina went for Barack Obama in 2008. North Carolina is a very purple state. It was a very purple state with 14 members in its congressional delegation. 10 of them were Republican and 4 of them were Democrat, because the state legislature has been in the hands of the Republican Party unbroken since 2010. And for much of that time, they've actually had a veto-proof majority, even over our Democratic Governor Roy Cooper. So they were able to kind of do whatever they wanted to do. There was no check on them, effectively. The only way there would be a check on them would be if the Constitution of the state would stand in the way. And that's what the North Carolina Supreme Court...
Oh, I see. That was the 2021 case you were saying?
Correct, right. And
okay.
So the 2022 election had to be run on lines that were not gerrymandered in that partisan way. And we ended up with 7 Democrats and 7 Republicans, which is kind of what you'd expect for a purple state that's split down the middle. So that was what happened in 2021. Then... in 2022, our Supreme Court here is 100% elected. The justices are elected. And so there was a major shift in the personnel of the court. It went from 4 to 3 in the hands of Democratic justices to 5 to 2 in the other direction. And so in an act of, we might call it activism, the newly constituted Republican-controlled North Carolina Supreme Court kind of reached back and said, remember that decision that this court reached, a year ago or so, 2 years ago? We overruled that decision. We conclude that partisan gerrymandering is not a violation of the North Carolina Constitution. Mm-hmm. And so, since the North Carolina Supreme Court now had rejected the theory that had gone up to the U.S. Supreme Court, lots of people were thinking, well, if the North Carolina Supreme Court has changed their minds about what the North Carolina Constitution means, then I guess the U.S. Supreme Court really doesn't have anything to review anymore. Mm-hmm. But the majority concluded that for some rather technical reasons, the decision that was before the North Carolina Supreme Court opinion that was before them, the U.S. Supreme Court, retained the markings of a live controversy. There was still a matter of disagreement that was justiciable, subject to judicial review. And so they decided to hear the case, and then they concluded that then the independent state legislature theory is a theory that says that because the Constitution says that the time, place, and manner of elections will be set by the legislatures of the states, this argument was legislature means legislature and legislature only. So no entity, no body, no official in the state, in any state, other than its legislature, can do anything affecting elections.
And just to be clear, because this is what you're talking about being up at the Supreme Court, was the decision of the earlier North Carolina Supreme Court saying, no, you're not allowed to do this partisan gerrymandering. The folks who didn't like that decision were appealing it, and they were pointing to that clause of the Constitution, but also ignoring the part that said subject to Congress changing the law. But still, they thought they were reading state legislature to mean suddenly a state legislature could never be reviewed by its own state court. Right,
could never be reviewed by its own courts, could never have regulations that were created by an electoral commission, nothing other than the state legislature's statutory law could possibly determine anything about the time, place, and manner of elections. And, that to me, that fails the test of intuition. State governments are more than just their legislatures. state constitutions create systems of government that include legislatures, but they also include other bodies. So it seemed deeply counterintuitive to think that the U.S. Constitution would have placed the U.S. Constitution, who, by the way, the framers of which were so interested in fracturing power, in making sure that there were checks and balances, the president can veto legislation, the Supreme Court can review, that group of people would have empowered just the legislatures of the states to do whatever they wanted to do with election districts is, I think,
it's counterintuitive, because you could also imagine, what if the state legislature said the way it's going to work is, the time, place, and manner, they could say it's only going to be 5 minutes in certain districts. It doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense, right? If
this rule really were the rule, then you would assume that if the state legislature said the way this election is going to be decided is by a coin toss, in each district,
right?
Presumably, that's something that would then not be subject to review, and that just doesn't make any sense.
Well, thank you for indulging me on that. It's just, I think it's a very important decision. I know there are election law folks who are concerned because it didn't, first of all, they don't think the court should have taken it. And second of all, they're a bit concerned for other reasons. But I'll take the win.
Yes.
It could have been a lot worse.
Yes.
Okay, so let's get right into your book. How did you come about making the concentration camps that we set up for Japanese Americans and others from other older generations from Japan during the war? How did you make that the subject of your research?
There's kind of two answers to that question. There's kind of a surface answer and a deeper answer. The surface answer is that my first teaching job was at the University of Wyoming, where I was teaching constitutional law to 80 students. It's a very small law school, so I was teaching the whole first year class, which was 80 students. And they, we would cover the Korematsu case, which is a decision in which the U.S. Supreme Court in 1944 upheld the removal of Japanese Americans from the West Coast, said it was not a violation of the Constitution. I was teaching that case in my constitutional law class. And to these Wyoming students, this was long ago and far away. This was somebody else's story. This was somebody else's history. And very early on in my stint in Wyoming, I learned that one of the 10 camps, and I use the word concentration camps, I use it advisedly because I don't mean to analogize it to a place like Sobibor or Majdanek or Birkenau or Auschwitz when I use the term concentration camps. I use it because it was an historically authentic term that was used by everybody at the time, from the prisoners all the way up to FDR, called them concentration camps. I learned that one of those camps was in Wyoming. And so I thought, I'll just, maybe as a teaching device, I'll just try to learn a little bit about that camp just so that I can bring it into the classroom and say, hey, ask your parents about this camp. Ask your grandparents about this camp, because this was in your own backyard. Mm-hmm. And I learned about some events that had happened at that camp that were unique among the 10 camps, having to do with resistance to the military draft by Japanese American prisoners. Mm-hmm. And I grew very interested in that story. Young men had resisted the draft and then prosecuted in federal court. I had been a federal prosecutor before going into teaching. I just started to kind of become interested in that case and that camp, and ended up really throwing myself wholeheartedly into that research, and that became the subject of my first book. So that's the surface answer. The deeper answer is that the story resonates personally with me. It's not my family's story, but it's also not my family's story. So my father and both of my in-laws, both of my wife's parents, were German and Austrian Jewish refugees from the Nazis. All three of them born in Austria and Germany in the late 20s, early 30s, and all of whom got out when kind of near the last possible moment when getting out was still a
When
thing.
was that? Like 1939 or earlier?
My grandfather was taken to the Buchenwald concentration camp in November of 1938, which is when the so-called Kristallnacht pogroms occurred.
Yes.
So he was seized. My dad had vivid memories of this as a 7-year-old boy. He was taken to Buchenwald and stayed there several weeks and was then released with the well, they were doing that at that time.
Okay.
They were still, so this was 38. This was before there were death camps, right? So this was when they were still trying to scare German Jews into leaving Germany. So basically, he was told at the gate of Buchenwald, you have until December 31st to get out of the country. And if you don't get out before, then you're subject to recapture. So on December 31st of 1938, my grandfather and my dad and my aunt got on a train and went into Switzerland, where a family friend had managed to arrange some accommodations for them.
Oh, my God.
And then in the case of my mother-in-law, she was from Vienna. And of course, things through the 1930s in Vienna for Jews were fine because it was an independent country and the Nazis were not in control. But when the Nazis rolled into Austria and the Austrians welcomed them with open arms, things went from 0 to 60 for Austrian Jews. Things that had taken, 6-7 years to progress for German Jews happened pretty much overnight for the Austrians. And so my mother-in-law didn't come to the United States until 1939. So anyway, I had grown up, with these stories about my own grandfather's incarceration and my dad being chased through the streets by the Hitler Youth and stuff. It was just, I knew these stories since before I could remember. And I grew very sensitive to the idea of the persecution of an internal, racially identified minority group, scapegoating. And that's what, the Nazis defined Jews as a racial group, not a religious group.
Yes.
So when I started to study what the United States government had done to Japanese Americans and started to interview elderly Japanese American folks for that first book, I felt in some ways like I was talking to my father. These old men that I was talking to were sharing stories that had a similar fabric to them, that were the stories that I grew up with.
And how did you find them?
To make it clear, I think this is just working through, in a way, for the last 25 years, I've kind of been working through my own family story, but from a little bit of a distance, since I'm not Japanese American.
No, I appreciate both the surface and the deeper story. I mean, I think the surface story gave you the opportunity. There you were. Right. And then you just didn't stop there. I want to ask you two things. With the students, when you said to them, hey, you're in Wyoming, there was this camp right in the mountains. And when they went out, did any of them get on the phone and talk to their family and bring you stories back? Or was there kind of this sort of, we don't want to talk about it?
I never heard. So what I did hear, so there were some students who had grown up in Cody or Powell, Wyoming, which were the two towns just on either side of where the camp was. And so I do recall a few of them saying that they remembered that, they had driven past the place. Their school bus might have driven past the entrance to the camp. Not obviously not when it was a camp, but, in the 1980s or the 1990s. So I did hear that there were some students who actually kind of knew that the camp was there. If there were students who were asking their parents questions about what they knew and whether their family had had any involvement in it, that I don't know. They didn't share that with me.
So let's talk about, before we get into the people, the sort of do this by the numbers, because there's a time frame here, and there's a number of people who were, removed from where they live. So is everyone leaving? Was everyone? And by the way, we start with. So, can you give me the time frame first, where FDR has this executive order to when they were shut down?
Right. So Pearl Harbor was December 7th. We know.
1941.
Right. Yep. February 19th, 1942, was when Roosevelt actually signed the executive order that authorized the commanding general on the West Coast to put this process in motion. The decision had actually been made a week or 10 days before Franklin Roosevelt actually signed the order. So early February was when this started. And then the first thing that happened is that the military commander started designating lots of areas as military zones from which he had the authority to exclude people under the executive order. First thing was a curfew, a dusk to dawn curfew that was imposed on people of Japanese ancestry.
Can you stop for 1 second? Location-wise, were all of these designated military zones in California?
No, they were up and down the West Coast. So it was all within what was called the Western Defense Command, which was a military geography, not a civilian geography. But it included Washington State, Oregon, California, and actually the southern half of Arizona as well. Mm-hmm. So in those areas, that's where the general, his name was John DeWitt, that's where he began imposing these first curfews, and then after the curfews, orders that Japanese Americans report to be removed from their homes and taken to parts unknown, basically. And so that happened. Those removals took place. Very early ones were in very end of March into April, May of 1942 was when Japanese American families were being removed. And I say families because that was the distinctive thing about this program, right? We were fighting Germany, Italy, and Japan.
Right.
This order affected U.S. citizens of Japanese ancestry in exactly the same way as it affected aliens, people who held Japanese passports. So the citizenship line fell away in the case of the Japanese, but it did not in the case of Italians or Germans.
So this order, so that which makes the racism so apparent. The decision was made to out of fear that people might not be loyal to the United States. I'm not justifying it. I'm just saying what the claim was. That this general could designate these military zones, curfews, the removal. Were they removing actual German and Italian nationals as well?
So there was a different legal system that applied to German nationals and Italian nationals and some Japanese nationals, because during a war, the government has had the power to detain enemy aliens, citizens of a country with whom we're in an active war. That has existed since 1791, like the Alien and Sedition Acts. Like that. That was a legal framework under which the government did arrest some hundreds of Italian citizens and some thousands of German citizens. When I say German citizens, I mean citizens of Germany and citizens of Italy.
Yes.
But that authority to detain those people did not apply to U.S. citizens. There was no legal authority to place them directly into detention. That's what Executive Order 9066 did, and that's why it was so shocking, because there was no existing legal authority for this ever until the president signed this executive order.
And so then suddenly, it's pretty quick, right? We have Pearl Harbor is bombed, the military base is bombed December 7th, and by February, you have these military zones, and we're talking about over 100,000 people who ultimately, right, were moved.
Something like 120,000, of whom two-thirds were U.S. citizens.
So 2/3 of them. So we get, roughly 120,000 people are forcibly removed from their homes.
Yes.
The parallels to what was going on in Nazi Germany and occupied Austria and everywhere, and Poland, everywhere else, it's so similar. And people were forced to sell on the cheap all their assets if they could even sell them, right? What was happening?
Which is another point of similarity, of course, right? The German government created this program that was called Aryanization, which basically encouraged and then forced Jewish people to transfer their property out of their own hands into the hands of so-called Aryans, racially approved Germans. And so, there were massive losses that were going on in the Japanese American community, not forcible transfers by the government, where the government would literally come in and force somebody to sign a deed transferring something to a white person. But because they knew that they were going to have to leave, and they typically only had a couple of weeks to get their affairs in order, people scrambled to do whatever they could with their property. And that often meant selling it to neighbors or at flea markets at, pennies on the dollar, because the white buyers knew that the Japanese Americans were over a barrel and not in a position to negotiate. Many Japanese Americans tried to store property in church basements, in friends' garages, and so on. And needless to say, when Japanese Americans came back at the end of the war, most of those places had been ransacked and looted.
And so were they taken by bus or by train to these different, okay. And how many different, I'm still on the numbers just to get a flavor for this. You chose 3 different camps. 2 of them, one of them was in Wyoming, near where you had been a law professor. 2 were in Arizona, although one of the ones in Arizona was actually on an Indian reservation there. Why did you choose those 3 out of the how many that there were?
Yeah, so there were the War Relocation Authority, or WRA. I'll probably end up using that acronym. So WRA, civilian agency that came into existence in March of 1942 specifically to run these camps. They had 10 of them. And so I chose 3 to focus on. One of them is, as you say, the Heart Mountain Camp in northwest Wyoming. And then there was the Poston Camp in Arizona and the Gila River Camp in Arizona. I chose them for a variety of reasons. They were each presented a slightly different profile of the way in which a camp could be run. So the camp in Wyoming was created by the War Relocation Authority, and it was run by the War Relocation Authority solely. The camp in the Gila River camp was on the land of the Gila River Indian community. It was reservation land. And the government asked the Gila River Indian community if they would accept this, and they said no, and of course the government put it there anyway. So you have this camp on reservation land. And then the Poston Relocation Center, which was the other Arizona camp, was actually initially run not by the WRA, but by the personnel of the Bureau of Indian Affairs.
Which had a different acronym then. The BIA was something else, right?
It was the OIA, Office of Indian Affairs.
Okay.
Yeah. Right. So you have 3 different sort of, I guess you might say, management systems. 3 different sets of influences that are sort of shaping the history of those camps. So that was one reason I chose those 3. Part of the reason I chose the Heart Mountain Camp is that I had actually met the lawyer about whom I write in the book at the very beginning of my career and at the very end of his. He was an elderly man, and I met him in Laramie, Wyoming, when I was still there on the faculty. So since I had met him, and because I've done a lot of work about preservation of the Heart Mountain Camp, curated a museum there and stuff, I thought it made a lot of sense for me to write about Heart Mountain. The other 2 I wrote about for the reason I just said, which is that one of them was run by the Office of Indian Affairs. The other one was not run by the Office of Indian Affairs, but it was smack dab in the middle of a very remote place on an Indian reservation.
What makes your book so unique is sort of revealed in the title, lawyer, jailer, ally, foe, all one person,
yes,
right?
Correct.
And I wonder why you, I suppose it's because you had already met one of these lawyers early on, but why do you think you chose to focus on, this sort of centers these Caucasian men who were in the role of being the main lawyer at these 3 camps, as opposed to centering, let's say, the people who were imprisoned there. Although you do an excellent job of bringing everyone's point of view in, this is incredibly unique that you've done this, but can you tell me a bit why in the context of this history that you chose this angle?
Well, let me first say that I would never have chosen this angle at the beginning of my career. I've this is my fourth book, and the first three were all very much about the experiences of the prisoners. And so in this book, I felt a little bit of some ground underneath me to try to come at it from a different angle without hopefully drawing the objection that, why are you writing about these places and not writing directly about the prisoners themselves? The reason why I came at it from this angle, I guess I can think of one main reason and then a secondary reason. The main reason is that over the last 12 or 13 years, I've grown very interested in the idea of the perpetrator.
Uh-huh.
What is it that leads people to either commit outright crimes or, in any event, to be to lend their energies to systems of racial persecution, racial injustice? I've spent a bunch of time thinking about that in the context of Nazi Germany. But it seemed to me that if we are persuaded that these camps were a site of injustice, that they were wrong, then that means there must have been people who were perpetrators. People weren't being murdered there. People weren't being, starved and exposed to disease as they were in the Nazi context. But still, these were sites that were unjust. These lawyers knew they were unjust, and yet they helped to run them anyway. So this was an opportunity to think about, what is an American perpetrator? What does that look like? We don't really have much of a literature about perpetrators in the American system. We tend, for very good reasons, to focus on the experiences of those who were persecuted. Those who suffered under the Jim Crow laws, those who suffered by the policies towards Native Americans. We don't tend to think as much about what is it that was leading lawyers and doctors and legislators and ordinary people to participate in these systems. So that was big part of the reason. These guys struck me as a great window into the basic idea that systems of injustice don't get run by monsters. They
Exactly.
don't. It's not 100% Bull Connor. Most people working to sustain a system of injustice are not monsters. They're ordinary people who to greater and lesser extents share in the racial structures and schemas of their day, of course, but who have other much more mundane reasons for being involved, reasons that I think any of us could identify in our own lives as reasons why we participate in things that we might find a little bit troubling. So that's the main reason. Let me just say quickly, the second reason is that these lawyers, because they were lawyers and because part of their responsibility, perversely, was to serve as a law office for the prisoners, they had crossing their desks the kinds of things that small town lawyers have to deal with all the time: petty crime, gambling, divorces, custody battles, assaults, all of these kinds of the sort of grittier aspects of everyday life came across their desks. These are things that the prisoners who have given oral histories, they don't tend to talk about that stuff as much. Nobody sits down with an oral historian and says, let me tell you about Manzanar, because that's the place where my husband cheated on me. Nobody does that. And why would they? But these records that I relied on, this copious correspondence that they left behind, really kind of opened up a window on aspects of daily life in the camps that has not really been well documented in the literature. And so I think somebody who reads this book, first and foremost, will be thinking about complicity, but they'll also be kind of looking into the camps through a little bit of a different angle and understanding some more about the lives, about the kinds of things that happened in the lives of the people who were unjustly imprisoned there.
Well, it's funny. You should say people will be thinking about complicity. What I was thinking, because I like to listen on Audible and also read a book I'm doing for the podcast, because it allows me to, absorb it wherever I am, read it straight through for a few days. And what I was thinking of is this would make an incredible film, because I want to commend you on bringing these people and each of these camps to life, when other than with the first person, you mentioned Jerry Housel, you didn't meet the other two men, Ted Haas or Jim Terry. And you met Jerry Housel years ago. And so knowing that, you just mentioned you were relying on a black and white paper record, I'm curious where that record was, and if you made copies, or I'm just, as a writer, I'm wondering how you did this, where you did your archival research, and since there were, and since there were each of them produced over the years, they were at these locations, hundreds of pages. Did you read it all? Tell us, pull back the curtain and tell us how you did this.
So this book exists because the solicitor of the War Relocation Authority, the head lawyer, who was in Washington, required that all of the lawyers that worked for him out in the field send him bi-weekly letters in which he asked them, he said, I don't want to know how many wills you're drafting. I don't want to know that. What I want to know is, what problems are you encountering? What's life like there? What are you experiencing? I want you to be interesting, and I want you to be colorful. And the lawyers, by and large, honored that. So they were churning out these letters. Some of them who really behaved did it every 2 weeks. Some of them tended to lag behind a bit. But all of the lawyers at all of the camps produced hundreds and hundreds of pages of single-spaced correspondence. A letter, one of these biweekly reports, would typically be 4, 5, 6 single-spaced typed pages, with numbered topics that ranged from very technical legal problems they were encountering to a sad story that one of them happened upon when they talked to a prisoner about some problem they were having with their property back in California. So for this book, I read, it's in the National Archives, by the way. All of these records are in the National Archives. And I would go up to Washington, D.C., or some of the records were also held in duplicate at the University of Arkansas, for reasons I won't get into. But I would sit in the archive with my phone, and I would take picture after picture after picture after picture, just like snapping photos.
I have done that. It's insane, right?
You don't even have time to read it, because you'll read it at home. You're just trying to, none of this stuff exists online. Yeah. So I would spend days furiously photographing these letters, and then I would come home and read them and catalog them and take notes on them. And what I found was that, after you read 300, 400 pages of a person's writing, especially when they've been encouraged to be personal, you start to get to know them. I mean, not in the way that you would get to know them if you were living with them, like if you lived in their time. But this is a much richer and more personal window into historical actors than we typically have. Except in the case where somebody keeps a private diary. These weren't quite diaries, but some of them were diary-like. So that's what enabled me, that was what gave me the foundation to think that it might be possible to write this book not as a dry academic, they wrote this many wills and they had conflict with this state official, but instead to identify episodes, things that actually happened, and try to narrate them as a story. Rather than to present them from the kind of third-person omniscient scholar perspective. And so what you end up with is something that reads like a novel. It's not a novel, but it kind of reads like one. If it were a novel, if this were true historical fiction, I would have created characters. I would have had love stories. I would have had, pitched conflict between people. I would have written something that was kind of gripping in the way that novels can be gripping. And I didn't do that because I didn't feel comfortable straying from the historical record in that way.
And I'm glad that you didn't, because it's still incredibly fascinating, because you're watching, what you're able to do is you take each of these men, Jerry Housel, Ted Haas, and Jim Terry, through, I think Jerry and Ted were only at their camps about a year, and Jim maybe a longer period of time.
Jim was there for the whole camp's existence.
Which is how many, when did that,
40,
I didn't get the ending.
He was there for 3 years, so end of 42 until the end of 45, Yeah.
Which isn't entirely surprising given his personality type. I mean,
yeah, that's
true.
If
I get it right, you get Jerry, who is just kind of an ordinary sort of, kind of by the book, not nice guy. His wife was from near the area, and he kind of has an awakening while he's there and needs to walk away from the place.
Yeah.
And he has and there's a sort of a parallel character that you always pair them with of Japanese descent from each of the camps. For him, it was Kyoichi Doi, very likable, force of nature guy. And then with Ted is maybe an alter ego, not for you necessarily, but for maybe. I see her. Ted Haas is, a liberal Jewish lawyer, very caring, who comes to this and has a different kind of, his transformation kind of goes in the other direction, where he becomes a bit of a perpetrator, and how the system transformed him in that way.
Sort of sucks him in a little bit. Yeah.
And then, with each of these folks, you find out what happens to them after. And then Jim is a sort of, waspy blue blood guy, who's extremely conservative, is so unaware of the racial dynamics around him. And you do that very well by pairing him with his assistant, Kimiko Yamamoto. And I have a question for you about that, where through what she does and doesn't say, you can just see how clueless he is. But he's also complex in that he was a huge advocate for the people there, for their property rights, for a co-op that was run by the prisoners. He was a mixed bag in a different way. And I think you tried to create an awakening with him. Maybe it was more of a confrontation where he was forced to look at himself, perhaps. What I wanted to ask you is, I don't know, with Kimiko Yamamoto, how did you, there are things that there are conversations you ascribe to Jim Terry and his wife, or Jim's perspective on her. And I wonder if you invented some of that, or you imagine him thinking those things, or is there something in writing where he actually said the things about her that were kind of, go ahead.
There are contemporaneous records from others, not from him, but from others, that document that he had a secretary, that the secretary ended up renouncing her citizenship and going on a boat to Japan during the war. And that Jim Terry was utterly shocked by that and had no idea why, could not understand why she was doing it. And that he tried to persuade her not to go. And to the extent of even sort of trying to find her other jobs in the camp system and so on. So there were some records, I won't go into where they came from, but there were some records that documented all of that. So the dynamic that I described there was a very real dynamic. There was a secretary, a Japanese-American secretary. There are other records that make crystal clear that Jim Terry was he was almost a self-confessed bully. That he was very tough on people, very tough on Japanese-Americans, utterly ununderstanding of the subjective experiences they were going through. Mm-hmm. So I took liberties in the sense that I created situations in which that dynamic was evident, right? So I don't actually know that she was sitting in the room taking notes of when he's blustering on about people being, subject to prosecution for treason.
Right. But you can imagine that she heard something like that, and you could just...
She was his secretary. She would have
Yes.
she would have been his
Exactly.
stenographer. She was working with him every day. And so that's a situation where But I
like that you took that liberty. In other words, I think that's what makes it so strong that you imagine her getting up and leaving, or, feeling red-faced, whether that scene happened or not. This is the kind of thing, but you're careful, I think, in the places where it seems that you would have added that. That's an example of something I think that makes your book come to life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the back of the book, there's extensive notes that indicate where all of the events and some of the documents that appear in there and some of the conversations that I document. The reader will, if the careful reader can spend time in the back of the book and see very clearly that all of this stuff actually happened, and that I was also taking liberties to try to build them as stories rather than just as dry historical narratives. There's a scene where Jerry Housel and his wife go to the movies. And do I know that they went to the movies? I don't know that they went to the movies. They were young. They were newlyweds. There was one theater in town. It did show that movie that they go see during the war. So, I know that it was there. Do I know that they actually went to that restaurant in that movie? No, I don't. But I was able to use the artifice of them going out to dinner and a movie as a newlywed couple, and then encountering an unpleasant guy from the town who had views that were very representative of the kinds of views that townspeople had at that time. I was able to, sort of create something that showed the dynamic that Jerry Housel, that I know he had between his job working for the camp and living in these surrounding hostile communities.
And I think I really think it works, and I admire your ability to do it and also show restraint. In other words, because once you go there and say, well, I'm inventing this, why not anything else? But because it's clear where it is. I just want to ask you, before we start to wrap things up, about, I think my favorite character in the whole book, person, is Thomas Matsuda. Matsuda. Can you tell me a little bit about him and how you decided to include him? Was he just a lot? Was it just because of the hearing that shows up in the paperwork, or how did you decide to make him?
So Thomas Matsuda was an American citizen of Japanese ancestry, relatively rare in his generation that he actually went to law school and became a practicing lawyer, and was practicing in Seattle in the late 1930s into the early 1940s. At that time, the U.S. was not at war with Japan, and Matsuda did a little bit of legal work for the Japanese consulate in Seattle, inconsequential work, but nonetheless work for the Japanese consul. What this meant was that when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, a few days later, the FBI went around and started arresting some people, Germans, Italians, and Japanese and people of Japanese ancestry, for having engaged in what they thought was suspicious behavior. In his case, he was ultimately charged with the federal crime of working as an unregistered agent for a foreign country. So his post-Pearl Harbor experience was different in the sense that he was arrested not to be sent to a camp. He was arrested by the FBI and charged with the crime of serving as an unregistered agent. He was then put on trial in Seattle, in federal district court in Seattle, for that crime in February of 1942. And remarkably, 12 white jurors, 2 months after Pearl Harbor, acquitted him of that crime. I mean, if you would ever imagine that a person would stand no chance in front of a jury, it would be a Japanese American 2 months after Pearl Harbor appearing before an all-white jury, charged with serving as an agent for Japan.
Because he wasn't an agent for Japan either.
That's right, because he was not. And the jury obviously saw that this was a completely bogus case. So he was acquitted. He then gets picked up and taken off to Poston, the Poston Relocation Center.
In Arizona.
In Arizona. And that's where he decides to join the project attorney's office, to join Ted Haas's office, and to work alongside Haas as a member of the legal staff of that camp. This was not completely uncommon. There were Japanese Americans in the camps who held a number of different kinds of positions of authority in the system, always answerable to a white official, of course. And so he actually was working with Ted Haas. It's very clear from Haas's correspondence that they had a very, very warm relationship, very supportive relationship. One of Ted Haas's big beefs was that he believed that there were way, way, way too many white people running Poston. He argued vociferously that they should be eliminating the white staff wherever they could and placing the camp into the hands of Japanese Americans, allowing them to run their own affairs. So he was a big supporter of Thomas Masuda's. Ted Haas takes ill and has to go to Los Angeles for surgery and a lengthy convalescence. I mean, we're talking 2-3 months worth. And he lobbies during his absence for Thomas Masuda to step into the role of the project attorney at Poston. So he became the top lawyer at the camp. So you have this odd situation in which you have a Japanese American concentration camp run by a government agency that has a law department, and that law department is run by Thomas Masuda for 3 months while Ted Haas is gone. That meant that Thomas Masuda was writing every 2 weeks back to the boss in Washington. So there is...
I see. This makes a lot of sense. I see. So you see this in the record.
Right.
Yep.
So there are, I don't know, a dozen letters or so that Masuda ends up writing, which are more reserved than the kinds of letters the white lawyer wrote, for obvious reasons. You know, he was in a very delicate position as a Japanese American working in this white agency. But so, you know, I did have something of a window into Thomas Masuda's mind, nothing like I had for the white lawyers. And so I really take far fewer liberties in, I don't place myself much inside the mind of Thomas Masuda where I do with the other 3 lawyers, because I just didn't feel I had a large enough evidentiary record to support the kinds of inferences that I was making for the white lawyers. But the tragedy with Thomas Masuda is that even though he was acquitted back in 1942, he lives under the shadow of that charge the entire time he's in camp. It keeps popping up, you know, in intelligence documents that, you know, this was a guy who was charged with working as an agent for Japan. He'd been acquitted, but he never was able to shake or never able to step out from under the cloud that charge placed over him, even though he was acquitted. And so that becomes part of the challenge ultimately between Thomas Masuda and Ted Haas, men who respect and like each other enormously, but where Ted Haas is thrust into a position where he needs to begin questioning Masuda about whether Masuda is loyal to the United States. And that creates creates a real crisis of conscience, I think, for Ted Haas.
Yeah, and I'm not going to give away what happens to all these folks throughout and afterward. I encourage everyone to read this book. I just found it captivating. And for me, it helped me learn a lot about a part of American history that isn't usually included. It's like a sentence, you know, in an American history class, that this happened, and then there's the Karamatsu case, the end.
Right.
Exactly. You know, it's like, well, that's not. And I think as a lawyer, I think this would be a great case for a legal ethics and professional case. A great book to read for a legal ethics and professional responsibility course. Or Eric, I teach this course in the spring called Money, Law, and Power. And my students, we read reread 4 books, and I swap a new book in every year. And this would be a really wonderful one for students to think about, because there's definitely a role of lawyer angle.
Sure.
So
and in fact, Jen, to that point, so one of the marketing strategies, such as it is for the book that I've had, is to reach out to major law firms and try to, and ask them if I could come in and give a presentation to their attorneys or some subset of their attorneys about this book, for exactly the reason you say, which is that, yes, this is a book about lawyers dealing with their own involvement in a questionable system or an unjust system in 1942 and 3, but the dilemmas are much more general. Lawyers, it's almost impossible, I think, to practice law and not find oneself in a position where you're representing a client where you're like, I don't know about this company. Like, I'm not so sure I'm comfortable. Or as a prosecutor, you are part of the system of mass racial incarceration. Like you are. Like there's no avoiding that when you're a prosecutor. So we all, as attorneys, I think, could stand to think about what it is we do and how we resolve or suppress the ethical questions and the moral questions that we ought to be wrestling with about the way we spend our own lives and our own energies as attorneys.
Have any law firms taken you up on that proposition?
I've given presentations at, let's see, thus far, Brian Cave, Hogan Lovells, and then I have arrangements with Aiken Gump and Covington and Arnold and Porter, firm out.
Look at you, all these top tier firms.
Firm out in Arizona, the major Arizona firm, which is called Snell and Wilmer. It's obviously of regional interest for them. So, I'm trying to do what I can to get the book out into the hands of people who might read this and say, what would I do if I were in that situation? How would I have handled this dilemma?
Or instead, what am I doing now?
Or what am I doing? Right, what am I doing now? Exactly.
So what did I forget to ask you, or what did you want to talk about that we didn't touch on?
Yeah, I guess really the main thing that we didn't talk about is something that audiences often ask, which is, well, should these guys have quit? Like, are you saying, Eric, that that these guys were perpetrators, and as perpetrators, they were implicated in this system and therefore should have resigned in protest? And I find that a very challenging question. And it's a question, again, that I think is very current. For example, during the Trump administration, there were lawyers who did resign and explain that they were resigning because they could not feel comfortable with the things that they were being expected to do. So I'm very interested in this question of should I stay or should I leave? And the main thing that I really want the reader to try to understand is that the question is not that simple. Yes, there might be certain things that you're asked to do where you have no choice but to resign. If the camp director had come to Ted Haas and said, we're not using any trial here, but I would like you to sign this death warrant for this prisoner, you resign, right? That's something that's clear. But most of the rest of the time, you're spending your time on things that are nowhere near that stark. And where you actually have the opportunity to do some genuine good. So the real theme here is that lawyers, all professionals, have discretion. No lawyer has their boss literally looking over their shoulder every second of the day, watching everything they do. So people have discretion. And how people explore what the boundaries of their discretion are, how they figure out what their jobs actually are, how they figure out what their role actually is, what the possibilities of their role are, the possibilities to do good. All of those things are very, very interesting to me. And so I think that, rather than just ask the question or make the assertion nobody should have ever worked for this agency. I think it's much more useful to think, how could people work for this agency and try to steer it in ways that were protective of the interests of Japanese Americans, that lightened the burden that Japanese Americans were enduring, rather than making it heavier and more oppressive. So that idea of questioning the scope of one's own discretion in one's work, I think is something that is very important to me, and things that as I say at the end of the book, there's an afterword in which I talk a little bit about some cases that I handled back when I was a federal prosecutor that troubled me troubled me at the time, and certainly troubled me in retrospect. So that's, I guess, the only real thing that's in the book that I think the book kind of tees up for reflection that we hadn't discussed thus far. So I think that's an important thing. And again, one that I think anybody, even if they're not a lawyer, any professional, I think, can ask themselves, what's my role here? How do I know what my job is? Yes, I have a job description, but that only sets out the basic contours. How do I fill that in? Who do I want to be? How do I want to figure out what I can get away with in this job? And then how do I go about trying to do that without getting myself fired? I think those are useful questions for professionals to think about.
I think they are. And how, Eric, can people find you?
Well, so I'm a law professor at the University of North Carolina School of Law. And so you can certainly find me on the law school's website. I have my own website, which is eric-muller.net, ERIC-MULLER.net. It's Muller, but it's not like Robert Mueller, who spells it differently. You can find lots of stuff about me on that website. And of course, you can also just drop me a line. My email address is right there on my law school webpage. And nothing I like more than hearing from people who have engaged with these things that I've written and given me feedback, even if it's to tell me, I think you were way off base. I think there's nothing more meaningful for just about any author than just about any kind of engagement with readers.
Have you ever gotten anyone who says, I see a typo on page 47,
though? Of course.
Aren't you grateful? Because then at least you can fix it for the paperback,
That's right. Yes. Yeah. Of course, there's definitely the readers that are reading, with a very, very, with a magnifying glass for the little glitches and errors.
Well, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me. This was a wonderful conversation. I appreciate it.
Whew. So, aren't you glad you listened? And I think you're going to be even happier if you actually pick up a copy of Lawyer, Jailer, Ally, Foe. We in America need to talk more about what it means to participate in a system of injustice, whether that is something that happened in the past or how any of us benefit or participate in, which we obviously do because there's not full equality. It's clearly a goal for many, not for all. But all of us in some way are complicit in various systems of oppression. Just like the lawyers that Eric writes about, it's not like we can quit. You can't really find a place on the planet where there isn't something that needs to be done. As Maggie Smith, the poet we had on the show recently, has said, as the name of her memoir is, you could make this place beautiful, right? But we have to face the things that need cleaning up, the things that need changing. And I think part of that is facing the reality of our past, that we were operating concentration camps in the United States. And part of our past, and that lives on and has repercussions, and part of our past is the history of slavery in this country, and on and on. Those systems don't exist today, but others do. And as we go about our life and try to live the happiest and best life we can with our family and friends, we need to think about our place in history. And I think part of every day and every aspect of our lives should be understanding how we can help dismantle systems of injustice, and also do our best as we live inside of them to use our discretion to be good, kind, and part of the solution, not part of the problem. And I'll be back next week with another show as we continue to explore the writing process and the nonfiction world together. Let us know what you think. Send an email to bookedup@politicon.com. You can also write to Booked Up at P.O. Box 147, Northampton, Massachusetts, 01061. To keep up with the show and our featured authors, follow Booked Up on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen. And please, give Booked Up a 5-star review. It really will help other people find the podcast.